The Symposium with Aulak.
Hi guys, welcome to the Symposium. Welcome back to the film series. Just before we start, I'd like to just jog a memory and say that we've got onto Spotify. So if you look at the link in our Insta bio, you'll find our Spotify account. And yeah, we encourage you to give it a follow. In the Spotify account and elsewhere, as well as on Anchor, you'll find the link to our YouTube account. And yeah, if you like our content, please do subscribe to that as well. And we'll enjoy having you. And yeah, we'll try and keep churning it out. So today I'm happy again to be joined by James and Jay, and also my friend Gaurav. So yeah, Gaurav, you've not been on before. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm probably not as patrician posting as Jay or James. My letterbox is relatively new. I've only got probably about 20 or 30 films logged, but I've been watching films a lot longer than that. So I'm you can maybe put me at 70% the level of Jay and James, maybe.
Okay.
That might be an exaggeration, to be honest.
Have you watched? Today we'll be comparing The Big Lebowski with Inherent Vice. But before we jump into that comparison, Gaurav, have you watched anything recently that interested you for the right or the wrong reasons that you just like to talk about?
Well, I guess recently I've just been watching pretty much every Kubrick film in rough order, just from kind of beginning to end. And yeah, I think probably the most recent one I've watched was Eyes Wide Shut, and that was definitely a very creepy and unnerving experience, and probably, I think, Kubrick's scariest film that I did feel a bit odd after watching.
Oh, yeah, so you found it more scary than maybe the conventional horror film like The Shining?
Far more. The Shining is not scary at all. It's an excellent film, but I don't find it scary in the way that Eyes Wide Shut is.
Okay, no, that's quite interesting. I mean, James or Jay, do you have anything to add specifically about Eyes Wide Shut?
I've always said it's Kubrick's scariest film. I also think to an extent Eyes Wide Shut is probably his most fascinating film. It's the one I think that benefits the most from rewatches. I think there's so much there. There's so much to unpack. There's kind of, all these, I don't really want to go into it, but there's all these conspiracy theories, which I think if you watch the film and you've paid attention to the news in the past week, you can kind of understand where they're all coming from.
Yeah.
There's like some weird, mysterious stuff. There's, Nicole Kidman and Tom Cruise. I think it's a really interesting film.
Yeah, Jay, or James actually, you know quite a lot about the kind of production. I mean, Jay, you spoke to me in detail about it was quite a long, extensive production. Could you talk a bit about that?
Is it the longest in history?
It's something like that, isn't it?
It is. It's 400 days. It's the longest running shoot ever.
Why did it take so long?
Because Nicole Kidman speaks so slowly.
It's fucking Kubrick. That's why.
The story goes he hated Tom Cruise and decided to torture him as much as physically possible.
Oh yeah, no, Nicole Kidman. Probably Nicole Kidman talking at like a fucking snail pace probably didn't add to the pacing, or didn't add to the filming schedule.
Yeah, that's interesting. Have you watched any? So, did any of the other Kubrick films stand out to you, Gaurav? Last week we had Jay's hot takes about 2001. I don't really want to delve into that.
Okay, I'll keep it brief.
But any of the other ones that really stood out to you?
Yeah, other than 2001, I really enjoyed Doctor Strangelove. I think that's probably one of my favorite Kubricks.
I
really stood out to me.
Yeah.
And despite being one of his oldest films and very Cold War, nuclear warfare focused, it still stands up excellently today. I would by no means call myself a political historical expert in these time periods, but yeah, I'm still beautifully engaged, understanding everything, understanding the intricacies going on, and probably Full Metal Jacket as well, which I think gets a lot of unnecessary flack in the general public opinion, which I think it's a lot better than what I thought it was going to be from what I read.
What kind of flack have you read?
Well, just the standard stuff where people only really remember the first half, which is obviously a very intense, boot camp experience, and then the second half is very designed to be just kind of stupid, and they're just running around like headless chickens, and it loses a lot of focus. And in comparison, I can kind of see people losing interest in the second half, particularly. And on the immediate surface, they don't seem particularly linked, like really at all. I don't really agree with that, but yeah.
I mean, James, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's good. I think it was one of the first Kubrick films I saw. I've not seen it in a good few years now, but I never even realized people didn't think the second half was as good until relatively recently. But it turns out it's a big opinion. I think the preponderance of other highly rated war films, specifically Apocalypse Now, results in people, kind of dunking on it because they see it as like an inferior Vietnam film to Apocalypse Now, if you get me, as opposed to it being a bad film. But yeah, I mean, I always loved that film, and I always loved the story that they just went to an abandoned power plant and just blew it the fuck up.
Yeah, I mean, but Gaurav, to come back to Kubrick, what is it about him that made you want to do a kind of a marathon of his films?
Well, obviously he's revered as one of the greatest, most famous, influential filmmakers of all time, and I've seen a few of his films before. I've seen The Shining before. I've seen Clockwork Orange before, but that's really about it. So I kind of wanted to see pretty much all of them and really see how much of this is true, how much of it lives up, holds up, and just enjoy that experience.
I'm almost slightly similarly. I'm kind of undergoing a mini Paul Thomas Anderson marathon at the moment. I rewatched There'll Be Blood the other week and watched The Master last week, and today, and obviously for today I watched Inherent Vice. So going on a kind of mini marathon, and I'm really enjoying a lot of his work. Jay, do you want to talk a bit about Kubrick and perhaps what kind of makes him still so attractive, just for even not even proficient film fans, but even more generally? Like, what is it about his filmography that really stands out to people?
See, for me, I think one of the things that Kubrick does, possibly, I probably want to say he actually does it better than any other director, is he's got a filmography where there are no two films which are the same. He's got kind of an iconic film in pretty much every major genre. You've got Barry Lyndon for period drama. You've got Dr. Strangelove for comedy.
Satire.
2001 for sci-fi. A Full Metal Jacket, the war film. I think a lot of people, even if you're just a film fan, I think you will have come across one of his films just at some point without even necessarily realizing it's Kubrick. And I think his films, they're all very well made. They all did stuff that I think there's quite a lot of innovation going on in his films, and there's things that kind of have influenced directors from today. I do think, as much as I'm maybe the biggest fan of it, I do think a lot of his influence does come down to 2001: A Space Odyssey, because I think it was kind of Spielberg, he said it was kind of his generation's Big Bang, and I think that kind of, it's whether you like or dislike 2001, I don't think you can deny that it's an influential film, and I think it's the fact that he went from that and still continued to make throughout his entire career interesting, very top quality films that's kind of made him synonymous with kind of quality cinema.
No, I think that's all fair. So I think we should roughly then just move on to the kind of main comparison in today's pod, which is, as you said earlier, comparing The Big Lebowski from the Coen brothers with Inherent Vice from Paul Thomas Anderson. So James, despite you seeing, I think, 1,600 or 1,700 films, you had yet to see The Big Lebowski until recently. So even in isolation, ignoring the comparison for the moment, what did you think of it?
Yeah, I kind of thought to myself for a few years now, I think I did see this movie years back. And having watched it again, I can confirm I had seen it. It's just that it basically vanished from my memory. I thought, I laughed out loud a lot. I don't usually laugh out loud a lot on my own, but overall, I thought the film was pretty, it was very Reddit. There was a lot of kind of insufferable bro moments in the movie, and I was just like, this is like a kind of a, like a relatively stupid 20-year-old at a no-name Midwestern university who thinks he's like, this shit. This is his favorite movie.
But were you there for the Reddit content, James? That's the question.
I was not there for the Reddit content, but I thought the jokes were very funny. Like, I laughed a lot. I was like, this is good. But overall, yeah, I thought that the film was like, It took me forever to work out the damn political message of the film. The film was so overt about a political message. Like every 10 seconds it was like, yo, Kuwait. And I'm like, okay, like where the fuck does this fit in? And then I think like, maybe when I was sleeping, my brain managed to process it. And I think what they were trying to do is they were trying to remake The Long Goodbye. And then they were trying to say like, oh, you know, the disillusionment that in general society was feeling in the late 70s is similar to 90s nihilism, which I think is a really lazy comparison and sort of dubious at best. But I'm so confused as to why the movie was so keen on trying to set up Kuwait as like the generations of Vietnam. Like, since when was Kuwait anything like Vietnam? Whatever.
I mean, just briefly, for those who haven't heard of The Long Goodbye or haven't yet to see it, could you just give a brief explanation about that film?
Yeah, I mean, it's a Robert Altman film from 1978. I'm going to say the date's probably wrong.
1973.
1973. Oh, that's an even more perfect date. Anyway, yeah, basically, it links really well into our discussion today because it's about the same thing that Inherent Vice is about, which is that an era ended in the 60s. The modern American authoritarian state was founded, and then Robert Altman made an adaptation of a Philip Marlowe film. You know, people were expecting a big detective, shoot 'em up, but the film's just a really depressive, kind of like melancholic, you know, aimless, shaggy dog kind of story, which is more mourning of the 60s and sort of afraid of an authoritarian future more than, you know, shooty bang bang. Woo.
Yeah.
But it was very, very influential part of the new Hollywood movement, kind of a major auteur voice in mainstream cinema, sort of emerging into multiplex theaters. And a lot of people, I think, have cited it since as a major influence. Obviously, The Big Lebowski is like pretty much like on the nose, trying to be it. You've got Inherent Vice, you've got Under the Silver Lake, Mulholland Drive takes bits from it, you know.
Well, that does lead nicely into our discussion. So, but before we get into it, just Jay, I mean, I wondered what you'd like to say about Lebowski, because I know, similarly to me, it's one of your favorite films. You really enjoy watching it. So yeah, what are your overall thoughts on the film?
Yeah, so let's say I last watched, for argument's sake, The Big Lebowski, say 3 years ago. And I watched it again. Obviously, I found it's for me, I agree with James completely. It's a complete laugh out loud comedy. It's very funny. Some of the jokes are fantastic. I think every time I watch it, I notice new jokes come in. I can kind of see where James is coming from on some of the kind of political messages maybe landing a bit flat, but I don't necessarily care that much either.
Yeah.
Because I think ultimately the film is, to me, it's just a complete joy to watch. I love all the kind of weird dream scenes. I love this is a criticism Mark Kermode has of the film. He kind of says quite openly he thinks it's just a collection of scenes strung together rather than a coherent film with anything really to say. And I think maybe on this viewing more than ever, I could kind of see where he's coming from on that. But again, it sounds weird. It's almost like a bit of shit criticism on my part, but it's one of those films I just thoroughly feel kind of this sense of joy when I watch it. Can
I just ask you a question? So is that kind of perception that it's just a load of scenes strung together, could that have been a conscious choice by the filmmakers in perhaps a statement about nihilism, because that's obviously quite a constant theme in the film?
I don't know. I never really saw it as that. I think almost kind of the plot of the film is almost irrelevant, I would say. There's this long, complex story about a rug. Mostly, I think the idea of the film is, I don't even necessarily think it's about nihilism. I think it's anti-nihilism,
if anything.
Yeah, I agree.
I think it's about the dude and about the dude's kind of way of life and his kind of attitude to life and how that's kind of interacts with all these things that are going on. I mean, there is definitely one thing I've noticed. Again, I don't necessarily think it gives it kind of this genius insight, but I do think there is this element of, every single character in this film is in some way, shape, or form a kind of cinematic trope or a form of stereotype.
Yes.
But I think that mostly just gives it its comedic effect. I think most notably through Walter. I mean, the guy, he's a very funny character. There's like brilliant scenes where he Like one of my favorite scenes is where he goes, there's like this pacifist, and you've got Walter pulling out a gun on him, comparing bowling to Vietnam. It's very funny.
Yeah.
But I don't necessarily watch it and think, oh my god, this is mind blowing. But again, I don't think every film needs to be mind blowing. I think you can do the trick and just you can be an entertaining film and do that well. And I think Lebowski does do it well.
Gaurav?
Yeah, I think I agree a lot with James on this point, though I wouldn't say. I've seen it once before, I think a couple years ago, 3 or 4. And if you asked me back then, I would have said sort of like what James said, echoing, I would have thought it was a masterpiece, like a 5-star. I loved it. It was great. Rewatching it now again, I still very much enjoy it. And I agree a lot with Jay saying I noticed a lot more jokes. Like I definitely missed a lot before. Like a lot of the Kuwait stuff and the war stuff just kind of went right over my head the first time I watched it.
Yeah.
But I think I don't love it as much as I thought I loved it from back then, if that makes sense.
No,
but it's still definitely a great film. It's very enjoyable. It's a hilarious film. I think it's a lot more straightforward than people give it credit for in terms of the plot. Like I understandably the plot is very designed to be convoluted and not make sense, but it does. You can logically follow what's going on pretty clearly throughout the film. Like it's not difficult in that regard. It's sort of purposefully confusing in that way. And I think the other point I was going to say was, in terms of the political message of the film, I always thought it was more about just the Coen brothers trying to exclaim about the dude's way of life. And I thought the intro was very telling about that when they described the dude as, he is the man for the time and the city. Like he is the guy that embodies just this lazy 1990s, like LA, do nothing, just vibe, just live, and all this shit's happening on around him. There's wars going on. He doesn't care.
Yeah.
And then I think it's just a very enjoyable kind of relaxing film to watch.
So James, you touched on it briefly with your kind of comments about the changing of the kind of 60s era into American authoritarianism and how that links to Inherent Vice. So if you could just start us off with the comparison, or even just what you think about Inherent Vice as a standalone film. Either one.
Yeah, I mean, I really there's a place in my heart for Inherent Vice. Like years before the film came out, I was obsessed with the book, and then the film is just like a wonderful adaptation of the book. Like the dialogue is just lifted straight. I mean, it does what it wants to do incredibly well, and what it wants to do is it wants to. It's almost like what we were talking about last week when we talked about Sunset and we talked about sort of traditional or modern approaches to history.
Yeah.
Where instead of, it does name check Manson a couple of times, but instead of just being like, hey, look, there was an era of free, peace, and love, and X, Y, and Z occurred, and now that no longer happens, it sort of plunges us into an empirical experience showing what it is like to be part of such a fundamental transformation. And what you see is these two characters who appear on the surface to be very different, which is this detective, Larry Sportello, and this police officer, Bigfoot Bjornsson. Thomas Pynchon has a great penchant for naming characters. But they are, in many ways, we come to realize over the course of the film, they're actually, they're the same, they're very similar, they're the same person. They're both actors in this sort of hierarchical system whereby information is fed backwards and forwards across, police lines, private detectives, all the way down to the lowest community to the highest community. There's this information sharing. There's an ecosystem which works and which has been in place. And what we see is that other forces, which are never properly defined, kind of are sweeping in and breaking apart this ecosystem, and everything's collapsing in on itself. And it's about that sea change, about a change in American politics, which is obviously has been formative for, history since the 1970s.
Jay, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so I've not obviously read Inherent Vice. I'm about 400 pages into Gravity's Rainbow, which is also by Thomas Pynchon. I've seen this film before. I've seen this film probably about 4 times now. But I think one of the things I've got to say is, in terms of it being an adaptation, when you kind of read Gravity's Rainbow, one of the criticisms, it's a kind of a criticism, but I think it works brilliantly, is Pynchon's style is almost that he strings these words together. They all make sense on their own, and all these sentences make sense together. Then you read it and you just don't know what the hell is going on, and you're so disoriented, and there's like random narrative threads. And it feels like not only does he take the dialogue, but he seems to take inspiration from that kind of style of writing into the way he actually directs a film, into the way he edits it, into kind of Johnny Greenwood's score. I think it's almost like every single element in this film is designed to just confuse the absolute shit out of you as an audience. And it does it really, really.
It does.
It takes a couple of viewings to fully appreciate it. But for example, there's one of the things I noticed this time was there's the narrator character who there's a scene where she's talking and it cuts and she's just not there anymore. And there's another scene where he's talking with Benicio del Toro and they'll cut and they're just continuing the conversation exactly as it was, but just in a completely different place. As if kind of there's not been any change, but suddenly they've just moved within, the space of cut of the frame. So I definitely think there's kind of a lot going on where Paul Thomas Anderson's using every single filmmaking device possible to just disorientate and invoke this kind of sense of paranoia and confusion and this kind of haze that kind of clouds the whole film.
Do you think that kind of disorientated, or those devices and the disorientating effects are used to illustrate the changes that James spoke about briefly, societal changes, which are taking everyone by surprise and disorientating people due to the speed of change? I mean, it has actually some weird echoes to kind of the ideas of people being left behind in kind of the 21st century by globalization. Just the kind of a disorientating nature of the world changing around you while you're kind of sitting there in the same, just continuing your life in the same vein. I think the scene change between when Joaquin Phoenix and Benicio del Toro are having that conversation is a perfect example of that, where they're having their conversation, their life is continuing as normal, but the world around them, i.e. their scenery, their location, has completely changed, and they seem slightly oblivious to that. Yet they can't be oblivious to it because they must have been involved in the movement to move to the new place.
Exactly.
So it all seems, to be linking quite beautifully in that respect. I mean, Gaurav, what are your thoughts on Inherent Vice?
Well, I think I'm the only one here who's probably a lot less positive on it than all you guys. I've only seen it once as that one time yesterday, and I pretty much spent the majority of the film just hopelessly lost in the absolute mess of a plot, whatever was going on. I don't know. I was completely lost in it, but it was after the film, and I kind of read some of the criticisms and saw some of the themes that was kind of on display in the film that you guys have touched on, and I could kind of, retroactively in my mind, I can fit it in, and I can see like, okay, like this is going to this is going to this, but I would be lying if I said I watched the film and finished it and I was like, yeah, that was like really amazing. I definitely enjoyed it as a first time watch, and I think I particularly enjoyed the first third or first half of the movie when Doc's kind of going around and like every scene he's getting a new client and it's just adding and adding and adding to the same story, but it's just getting completely messed up, and he's basically lying to everyone about what he knows and what they know, and he's just scribbling like utter bullshit in his notepad. Like I really enjoyed that in the film, but then I think that comparing it to The Big Lebowski a bit, I think the difference is that when The Big Lebowski confuses you with its plot, it's the plot isn't that much of a focus in the film in terms of how it confuses you, whereas in Inherent Vice, the film is overtly and specifically deeply focused on the plot, and in that way it's confusing you, which is I think is slightly different, and I think that definitely tripped me up a lot during the film.
I mean, James, if you would like to perhaps then dive into the comparison more deeply and perhaps build on what Gaurav said there about the disorientating effects of both the films, and perhaps the fact that Inherent Vice is designed to do that.
Inherent Vice is, I mean, Pynchon is basically known for paranoia. Like that's his thing. Yeah. And obviously one of the key ways to get that is by the confusing plot. In actual fact, the plot does actually make sense. It does track. I think almost as much as The Big Lebowski, although it
Yeah.
might take another viewing to confirm it. But also, I think, a confusing plot in both cases, in both of The Big Lebowski and Inherent Vice, is basically serving to tell you that the plot doesn't matter. And I think in sum total, although Inherent Vice is also very funny and very zany and has these themes, the key, emotion after it is it's just an incredibly sad film. I mean, it's like pure melancholy. It's like, from our perspective of people in their 20s, it's like mourning for something that you never even had to begin with. It's just like, especially the last third of the film is a real, people always say, yeah, I love to watch this movie when I'm stoned. Like, it's a real bummer. I mean, it's really not a happy movie at all. Whereas I think maybe The Big Lebowski is a little more hopeful.
Yeah.
Jay?
Yeah, I just actually wanted to add in terms of the plot. There's this point in the film, let's say halfway through for argument's sake, it might be before the halfway, it might be after, but there's a point where Doc's got a board and he's trying to put the plot together.
Yeah.
And he's got all these like complex maps and he's just kind of staring at it thinking, what the fuck is going on here?
Yeah.
And for me, that's almost, in that scene alone, it's kind of saying, yeah, don't worry, no one understands what the fuck is happening.
Yes.
I think Joaquin Phoenix does it brilliantly, where just throughout the whole film, he just looks confused and he's just staring and I also think there's this kind of, one thing I really like about the film is there's a lot of moments where there's kind of this delayed silence, but in that delayed silence, it's actually just very funny because Joaquin Phoenix is just making these eyes as if to say, what the hell is happening? What's going on? I think it does kind of convey that you shouldn't really worry too much about trying to understand, or you should just kind of enjoy being lost in whatever the hell is going on. Whereas I think if we're going to compare them, I think the key difference for me is that if we're talking about The Big Lebowski, I don't necessarily think it matters about the plot, as kind of Gaurav was saying. You don't watch it thinking, oh my god, I really want to know what's going on with Bunny. Like, I didn't really care that much. But I think, and you can kind of brush it aside and just enjoy the scenes, whereas I think in Inherent Vice, you're almost meant to be frustrated and almost meant to kind of be completely caught up in this ridiculously complex web. And I think it kind of actually, they use it not as kind of, just the plot being confusing for the sake of being confusing, but actually to do it to create this sense of paranoia and like, this kind of haze that the film has.
Gaurav?
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with quite a lot of the points Jay was saying there, and also when James said it's a very melancholy film, it's most definitely true, and I think that probably serves to a lot of the point why probably people more prefer Big Lebowski, because it is just much more of a laugh out loud, upbeat movie versus this consistently melancholy, like kind of down, this era's dying kind of vibe going on in Inherent Vice. And I think in terms of just PTA, as PTA being PTA, the technical aspects of this film are like, they're phenomenal, really. Like all the sequences are shot beautifully, and there's just some lovely framing, and when he's using all these different long lenses and short lenses and shit, it just looks really cool. And a lot of the lighting, I think, it's a lot more subtle than I was expecting, but I thought it was used excellently, and I could definitely tell from the film that if you think of how you know things as a human being, there's things that you are aware of that you know, there's things that you're aware of that you don't know, and there's things that you don't even know that you don't even know.
Yeah,
What
and
are you,
a lot of Inherent
defense
Vice for me-
secretary?
And then a lot of Inherent Vice in me falls into that middle category where I'm watching the film on this first viewing and I'm going, yeah, my brain is telling me there's like so much shit I'm just not getting right now, but I don't know it yet,
I'm not sure if you guys got this, but although I was in my mind trying to compare it to The Big Lebowski, the film that really kind of slapped me in the face when I watched Inherent Vice that just came to my mind was Once Upon a Time in Hollywood by Quentin Tarantino.
Yes.
Not sure why, but I think it might have to do with the kind of hazy.
He's
relaxed...
making the same point. He's literally making the same point about the end of an era. It's like he definitely saw the film and then thought, I'm gonna make the film.
Yeah. And then I think that end of the era point is a strong one, but also just that the plot devices and the way that the pace of the plot or kind of its unconventional pacing and and almost procession just kind of drove a comparison there for me. I mean, I think what I really want to drive on next is the main comparison between the dude and Doc from Inherent Vice, in that although they both might initially seem to be kind of laid back figures who are kind of thrown into perhaps unfortunately thrown into the middle of a kind of mystery, the Doc perhaps more willingly than the dude. They tend to approach things reasonably differently, and I wondered what you thought of that, Jay. Just the kind of differences in the main protagonists of the film.
I think probably the key differences for me, the dude kind of has a very, laissez-faire kind of attitude to life. He doesn't necessarily get that emotionally involved in things. Like, he does kind of care. He gets a bit stressed about, what the Germans are going to do to his, his Johnson. But other than that, I think the dude's kind of detached from the story, whereas I think Doc is very involved, and I think around pretty much exactly the halfway point of the film, the story, his kind of job, which I think maybe he's a bit more relaxed, he just kind of takes all these like whatever the fuck's going on notes, and then it becomes very quickly involved into his past relationship with Shasta, and I think there's a lot more kind of an emotional connection between the film's narrative and Doc than there is between The Big Lebowski's narrative and the dude.
Yeah.
Like, we see it, I think, what I think is the best, I think it's the best scene in the film. I think it's actually one of the best scenes of Paul Thomas Anderson's career, which is the Ouija board scene where it goes into they're running in the rain with Neil Young playing.
Yes.
And then it fades in, and then suddenly he goes back, and then you've got the Golden Fang, which is now a dentist instead of a ship.
Yes.
And I think that scene there really speaks volumes of the whole film. It's Jock kind of going in, looking at this past that he's reliving, and now he's going back, seeing that it's been replaced by this new, mysterious, kind of weird corporate entity. Also, just as a side note, I think, just because I wanted to talk about this scene, it's also got what I think is the funniest moment of the film, where he hands the dentist a Chinese card. And the guy says, "What is this?" And he looked at the dentist being played by, an American actor, a white American actor. And Doc says, "Well, I figured you being Chinese, you understand that?" And honestly, I spat my drink out at that scene. I thought it was just so funny. It was just, I don't know, I think that kind of scene is one of those examples where the film attains this brilliant kind of mix of sadness, comedy, and then kind of everything else all at the same time.
Would you call it a tragic? Would you call it a tragic comedy in that sense?
Yeah, I guess so in its kind of own way. I think it almost kind of wants to defy categorization, whereas I think The Big Lebowski, ultimately, the dude is still, he's a fairly standard kind of stoner comedy, hero. But the Coens kind of paint him as this kind of icon and this kind of good man thrown into this bad situation, whereas I think the dude, there seems to be more nuance about him. I think he's a more complex character, certainly. He's one that I wouldn't really say I understand everything that he's going through. But I think the dude's kind of categorized by this sadness, Doc has got this kind of overwhelming sense of sadness to him, which the dude doesn't have. I think that's kind of the fundamental difference.
Gaurav, I mean, what were your thoughts on that specific comparison?
Yeah, I liked a lot of the stuff you said about the dude in the regards. I thought the dude is, for better or for worse, there is no change, there is no deeper meaning, and there is no greater sense of what the dude is beyond exactly what you see in the film. He's there.
He's passive. He's
completely
got
passive.
No personality.
It reminded me. Have you guys seen Big Trouble in Little China?
Yes.
That's one of my favorite films, and in that one, Kurt Russell is just, he's irrelevant almost entirely. He does nothing in the film, and I kind of get that vibe in The Big Lebowski, where he's just jumping from this to this. He's basically serving no purpose. Like, other guys around him are doing stuff, and like in that regard, the Coen brothers make no effort to present the dude as a deeper guy beyond exactly what they show you he is. And comparing that to Doc, it's very different in that Doc. In my opinion, he has quite a character arc in terms of coming to terms with the end of his era and his past relationship with Shasta, and that kind of culminating throughout the film. And he is a lot deeper character in the sense of a lot of the sadness he's feeling, and he's just he's going through a lot of stuff quite clearly throughout the film.
I think that's interesting. I mean, talk about that that kind of comparison. I think another interesting comparison that I got while watching Inherent Vice was the interesting score, because I'd watched The Master and There'll Be Blood recently, and obviously they're very characterized by percussive string work, especially perhaps getting slightly more legato when you get into The Master rather than There'll Be Blood. But There'll Be Blood, or perhaps both of them, perhaps in one hand, Daniel Plainview's State of Mind, and in the other one, Joaquin Phoenix's State of Mind in The Master. The strings specifically there are used to illustrate their perhaps very fragile mental states and their existence on the precipice of sanity. And it was interesting how that kind of orchestral score was completely absent in Inherent Vice, although it was still a Paul Thomas Anderson film. Whereas he adopted for maybe slightly more conventional sampling of actual songs. And I think that drove to a completely different kind of message about what the protagonist was going through. That instead of perhaps being on the precipice of absolute insanity or mentalism, we ended up with a perhaps wider point about, as we've spoken about, themes relating to culture and the country, which I think is shown well by the popular music which is used. I mean, James, what are your thoughts on the use of score in those two films?
I mean, I think what you mean Inherent Vice
and The Big Lebowski.
And The Big Lebowski. I mean, I think Inherent Vice very nicely balances like the period pieces which are being sampled from, and then Johnny Greenwood's score, which is a lot more at times menacing, at times a lot more melancholy. It's a very different tone from the more upbeat kind of rock songs for the most part being used. The Big Lebowski, I watched it 2 nights ago and I can't remember what the score was. So that's maybe saying something. I know there was a lot of popular music in it, but I don't remember any of it.
No, I mean, that's fair enough. I mean, can you specifically talk about, or at least engage with the idea of that I mentioned about the use of perhaps popular music in Inherent Vice as opposed to more percussive orchestral music that's used in other Paul Thomas Anderson films?
I mean, it just makes more sense because it's trying to establish a particular, maybe Boogie Nights has more popular music. I don't remember. It's been years since I saw it.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah,
I mean, the fact is that it's trying to establish that this film is a time and a place. That's what it is. And you can't have that time and a place with Johnny Greenwood's like almost postmodern score, can you? Yeah. Like if you stick the Phantom Thread soundtrack over the top, which is like just pure modernism, it's not going to work.
So Jay, you had a interesting point on Inherent Vice in the music.
Yeah, I'm actually going back to a scene that I just spoke about, the dentist scene. It was where the score really stood out to me because I'm not as technically, knowledgeable in music, but for me, the score kind of started going it was kind of like this it was almost like a piano note. It was like really tense and just kind of slowly building. And I found myself during this scene just feeling kind of this real kind of sense of tension from the music. And it built because obviously the film started getting more and more kind of going into like a darker, more paranoid kind of frenzy. And then they were in this car on drugs driving at night. And the score was getting actually really quite menacing if you're like really paying attention to it. And I think Johnny does a really good job at kind of using the music to create at once this, this kind of free, kind of drug-fueled vibe, and at the same time invoking these ideas of paranoia. And I think it's very subtle, but I think it is there, and I think it does help to create the overall mood that I spoke about at the start. I do kind of agree with James in terms of, I couldn't actually tell you what the score is to The Big Lebowski. I remember, obviously, you've got the kind of the opening bit with the tumbleweed. I can remember that. It's kind of a very classic film score, but obviously I think the use of contemporary music stands out, and not necessarily because I think, oh, this is genius using music, but I think because it works really well in the sense of the film, and it kind of brings this great it kind of helps build the kind of fun tone that the film goes for. Yeah.
No, I think those are interesting points, especially I like how you linked with James's point perhaps about the kind of mood that was being, or the zeitgeist that was trying to be captured by Inherent Vice, and then the wider societal points that come from it. I mean, Gaurav, what are your thoughts on the music?
I'm not even sure if The Big Lebowski actually had a score of its own, as opposed to just. I mean, I remember the songs, like the pop songs, and that fit the film very well. I honestly cannot remember an actual, composed piece of music specifically for the film that was used during it. And like a lot of what Jay said, that drug scene, the music definitely did really stand out. I think that car scene is probably one of my favorite films in the film, perhaps other than Josh Brolin deep throating that curved Magnum just constantly. But that drug fueled car scene, it does really get very intense and kind of very creepy, and the kind of cops, they're all kind of, the way he cuts the camera, they're kind of jumping in and out, and like they're kind of in different positions around the car. And I'm pretty sure at one point Doc swaps positions with the girl in the car, and that just like there's no transition, they just swap, and he's suddenly driving. I'm just what the hell, what the hell's going on? But I thought that was a really excellent sequence, and a lot of what James said, that this film really is the embodiment of a time and a place. This is the hippie lifestyle coming to an end and being replaced by more politicized, cold, controlling capitalism, and the music choice really fits that. I particularly really enjoyed during the scene where Doc and Josh Brolin go to eat at the Japanese restaurant, and there's just really subtly in the background is Sukiyaki playing, which is one of my favorite songs. It's just really just quietly playing. I was like, this is the vibe he's trying to give out with this film, that this is the time, just kind of get absorbed in what's going on. Sorry to keep linking it back to some of his other films, but I did spot a link to There'll Be Blood in the follow me if this doesn't make sense, do let me know, but in the way that the kind of Golden Fang, which was initially an illegal exploitative business, legitimized itself into the kind of innocuous dentist while perhaps not shedding any of its kind of corporate identity. I think that is a theme you can pick up from There'll Be Blood as well, where the kind of risk-taking, perhaps exploitative, perhaps not, but generally quite callous nature of American frontier capitalism became legitimized with Standard Oil, and was kind of overtaken by what was perceived as more acceptable forms of corporate culture, while maintaining substantially most of the kind of exploitative aspects that characterized its initial forms. And I think those are the points that Paul Thomas Anderson is trying to make, whether you agree with them or not. I mean, James, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. I've seen the film a bunch of times, but last night, maybe it's just because I was thinking about it because we were going to make a podcast, that thought occurred to me as well. I was like, I can actually see how this is pretty much linked with There Will Be Blood. I mean, I think it's more the more confusing thing is more this emergence of a new category of player that didn't exist, or at least the argument is that didn't exist before. Like someone so elite. Like if you watch one of the last scenes when he speaks with the don't want to spoil anything, but he speaks with someone very high up. It's like the highest up person. He tries and uses these phrases, like these stock phrases, these conversation starters that he uses with everyone else in the movie, but like they just don't work. And all of a sudden, when he's speaking, he just looks like a complete idiot. Whereas for the rest of the film, I mean, obviously he's not an idiot. That's, he's actually quite smart. But for the rest of the film, that's like how you converse. And suddenly it's become impossible to converse because this person's like in another league. It's like someone untouchable.
I mean, Jay, I'm sure you have something to add.
Yeah, I think in terms of also, we said this a bit about the Golden Fang, but I think one of the interesting things is the way what the Golden Fang is keeps changing throughout the film.
Yeah.
It starts off, he hears it and he assumes it's a band, and then it's a boat, and then suddenly it's this drug cartel, and then we go through a flashback and now it's this dentist syndicate, and somehow these things all link together.
Yeah.
And I think there's this kind of, I think that's kind of it. It's this idea, it's almost this kind of stream of consciousness kind of style into the Golden Fang kind of fits into the kind of stream of conscious style of the narrative in the sense that it keeps morphing into something else, but it still means the same thing throughout the entire film.
Yeah.
And I do think it's got its ultimate meaning. It's pretty obviously it's whether it's not necessarily capitalism, but it's kind of this 70s era corporatism that is slowly kind of polluting, the city of Los Angeles, which was once associated, at least the doc anyway, with this kind of 60s hippie era that he lived in.
I mean, Gaurav, you've seen There'll Be Blood as well, and I know you're a massive fan of it. Do you think Paul Thomas Anderson in those two films is making a nostalgic point about the past, or is he kind of satirizing what other people say about their past and their misplaced nostalgia?
Well, in There Will Be Blood, I don't think he's satirizing anything at all. I find it quite, reasonable that someone like David Plainview is going to go to this... Daniel, yeah, of course. Daniel Plainview is going to go to this, more removed part of America and suddenly bring this newfound brand of colder, more money-focused capitalism that they had never seen before. They were just a religious town by that small church. And I think Inherent Vice is a lot more satirical in that nature, and there's a representation of... I agree with what Jay said. It's not necessarily capitalism, but just this new modernist corporate dominant culture that was being brought in. I think that's really emphasized in The Dentist, in that when he turns that corner, it's just this giant... The difference between that, the little corner in the shop where he's sitting with Shasta, the convenience store, and then the way that looks is so kind of... It's more of an olden style building. It's got these angled glass planes that you don't really see anymore. Like, that's not a style that anyone has. And then he turns the corner and it's just this giant modern spiral glass metal building structure. And it's just obscenely huge in comparison. And he walks in, and I thought what was really weird is I thought it was a hotel. Yeah. I thought it was some kind of office building, but then it's not. It's just an entire dentist office. And I think that's when I think back at it, that's when it's really going... That's when PTA is going all out in his, this corporate culture is wild. It's this giant building, and it's literally just a dentist office. But inside it's the most weirdest corporate environment ever.
Okay, so I mean, I think it was then pretty clear, guys, which one we like better overall, considering that the comparison pretty much ended up being There Will Be Blood against Inherent Vice, I think, because that might have shown that I think There'll Be Blood is probably closer in caliber to Inherent Vice than The Big Lebowski is. But yeah, I mean, I wondered where you guys placed Inherent Vice in Paul Thomas Anderson's filmography, because all of you have seen at least 3 or 4 of his films. I mean, James, if you'd like to go first.
Yeah, I mean, I have a special attachment to this movie, so it might be my favorite. But maybe The Master, I guess, could be an alternative choice. Maybe followed by Phantom Thread. But again, it's Paul Thomas Anderson. I think all of his movies are fantastic, except for, Hard 8.
Yeah. Is that his first one? Is that the first one, right?
Yeah.
James, why is this just above, for example, specifically There'll Be Blood? Why do you like those 3 films more than that one?
But, I see. I just There Will Be Blood. I never vibe with it as much as like other people do. I think the movie's great, but I just never saw the meteoric genius that some people see. I'm like, okay, yeah, great, foundational myth of capitalism. Thanks very much. Moving on.
Jay, where do you place this film, Inherent Vice?
I'd say, so I've seen all his films. I'd probably put it in the top. I'd probably put it top 4, top 5. I'm one of those people. I think he's actually just made a bunch of fantastic films. I think his run from There'll Be Blood all the way through to Phantom Thread is pretty much bulletproof. But I would say maybe of those 4, Inherent Vice ranks 4th, but I still think it's a fantastic film.
Yeah.
I prefer it to like his 90s works, like Boogie Nights and Magnolia, which I think they're both fantastic films, but I think Inherent Vice is just that bit more interesting, and it's a bit more kind of unique and less kind of copycat. He's at this point, he's in his career, he's got his own style and he's a bit more self-assured. And I think it really comes off in this film that, Paul Thomas Anderson, he knows what he's fucking doing at this point.
Before I bring Gaurav in, I'd just like to ask Jay, I mean, you mentioned, because you know Paul Thomas Anderson's work better than I do, you mentioned that he has consistent kind of father-son themes in his film, but I didn't actually spot that very much in Inherent Vice.
No, I think Yeah, I was thinking about this yesterday. I think the closest parallel I see is Bigfoot and Doc, but it's very loose. It's a very loose thread. They're kind
Yeah.
of
None of that
thought
in
they were
Phantom Thread
more-
either.
I thought they were more brother. I
Yeah.
thought they were more brotherly
Yeah.
than father.
yeah.
sonly.
It's kind of got the whole like kind of different side of the same coin idea.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think in a way, not to spoil it because I know Gaurav hasn't seen The Master, but for me, the final scene with Doc and Bigfoot is almost like a weird inversion of The Master.
Yeah, I get that.
It's very similar in tone. It's very funny, but it's also kind of sad. I think it's one of his. I do think it's one of his better films. I think it's up there with the best films of the decade.
I mean, I'd say it's the difference in kind of funny in the Inherent Vice is funny because it's like it makes you laugh, but then The Master, without spoiling anything, is funny because it's almost ridiculously ludicrous and just almost pathetic or pathetic rather. And it's just kind of it makes you laugh in almost slightly darker way. But yeah, Gaurav, what are your thoughts on where Inherent Vice fits into Paul Thomas Anderson's discography?
I've only seen There Will Be Blood, Boogie Nights, and Inherent Vice, and I think There Will Be Blood I've seen it quite a few times. One time in 70mm print at the Prince Charles Theatre, and it is just definitely one of my favorite films of all time. I very much enjoy it. I would rank that as my favorite PTA, and then Boogie Nights and Inherent Vice. Kind of, I haven't seen Boogie Nights in a long time, so I don't know where I'd rank in that regard, but I definitely enjoyed that film a lot as well. And I can see a lot of what Jay said in that Inherent Vice is a lot more of his kind of, it's more of his own personal desires and style versus Boogie Nights. And I can see that. I can see over rewatches and time how that ranking evolves and changes.
Well, I mean, thank you guys. I mean, I really enjoyed that. I thought that was a really fruitful comparison. And I really enjoyed as well the bit at the start where we spoke more generally about Kubrick. I hope that you guys enjoyed it as much as I did. Just to remind you that we now are on Spotify and the link is in our Instagram bio. And yeah, we're also on YouTube as usual. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Spotify. And yeah, we'll keep churning out the content. Cheers, and see you next time on the film episodes from the Symposium. Thanks.
The Symposium with Ash Aulak.